Hello, everyone, and welcome to another wonderful day of chemistry. So today we're going to be talking about electrolytes. And no, they aren't just something designed to sell sports drinks. So when we're talking about electrolytes, we're talking about a very specific type of compound that when you place it in water, it breaks apart into ionic species. So one of the very important features is that it will break apart into two separate ions. Because what ends up happening is when these ionic species are present in the water, this is actually what allows water to conduct electricity. If you try and run electricity through pure water, it turns out it doesn't work. However, most water, including any tap water you've ever seen, has plenty of electrolytes present. And so when you try and generate a charge, the positive ions move towards the negative electrode, and the negative ions move towards the positive electrode. And it's this movement of ions that allows electricity to go through water. So if a compound breaks apart into ions when it's added to water, it's called an electrolyte because it splits in the presence of electricity. So it's a split electric charge. And it turns out that many different ionic compounds are going to tend to form electrolytes whenever you place them in water. So let's take an example of, say, something like sodium chloride. You go ahead and place it in water. It breaks apart, it disassociates into a sodium ion and a chloride ion. So this is one of the reasons why it's very important to know your basic ions, because it can help you look at a bigger compound and try and identify the base constituents. However, if you have a molecular compound, it tends not to dissolve. So in general, most molecular compounds will not be considered electrolytes. So if I take something like sugar, I place it in water and I just have dissolved sugar. So just dissolving isn't enough to call something an electrolyte. However, it is worth noting that there are some types of molecular compounds that can break into ions when placed in water. So if a molecular compound breaks into ions, it's called ionizing. Go figure, you make ions. One of the most common classes of ionizing electrolytes or ionizing compounds are going to be acids and bases. So if I go ahead and place an acid in water, it tends to release a proton. And we'll talk more in detail about the structure of this proton, of this ion next semester. But for now, we can just treat it as a free hydrogen atom with no electrons. That's going to be our proton. And this takes place whether you're talking about something like hydrochloric acid, which is a strong acid, or acetic acid, which is a weak acid. But again, because they all tend to break into these protons. And we'll look into this a little bit more later. In contrast, most bases will tend to release hydroxide ions when placed in water. However, it is worth noting that not all of these species will completely disassociate. So for example, if we take something like acetic acid, it turns out when I place acetic acid in water, I'm going to release some protons and form some acetate. However, conversely, we'll also have some of the reverse reaction, where some of that acetate in solution will react with some protons and go in the reverse direction, forming acetic acid. And so if we ever have a reaction that's moving both in the forward and reverse direction, we represent this with this double-headed arrow, one in one direction, one in the other. Again, representing that the reaction moves in two different directions. And we tend to call this an equilibrium process. And if we have a species, an electrolyte that both disassociates but also reforms, we call this a weak electrolyte. So a strong electrolyte will completely disassociate. A weak electrolyte partially disassociates because you always have some of the reaction going backwards, reforming whatever we started with. So when we're looking at any sort of solute we place in water, so again, solutes, anything that dissolves in water, we can go ahead and categorize it in three major camps. If it doesn't end up ionizing at all in water, so we don't have any dissolved ions, it's called a non-electrolyte. And this would, if I put it in pure water, generate an insulating solution. However, if a solute does end up generating ions, the question is, does it completely break apart into ions, at which point it is a strong electrolyte, or does it only partially break apart? Again, leaving some of the original unionized solute present. In that case, it's going to be called a weak electrolyte. And these are going to be important things to kind of keep in mind as we move forward and talk about various dissolved species. However, next time we're going to be looking a little bit more at this idea of which species will essentially dissolve. So how can I look at an ionic compound and try and figure out whether or not it will generate a strong, weak, or non-electrolytic solution? So until then, take care.